My name is Sienna Hansen, and at 35 years old, I am a lie. On Thanksgiving night, amidst the cheerful noise filling our family's home in Colorado, my father, a respected retired colonel, raised his glass. He looked directly at my brother, Connor, a Marine Corps major, and then his eyes slid past me, cold and dismissive. "To Connor," he boomed, his voice filling the sudden silence. "At least one of my children understands what real service to this country means. A son who brings honor, not a daughter who quits for some meaningless desk job." The room went still. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but I could only stare down at my plate of cooling turkey, feeling as if I didn't exist. They don't know that my desk job is a cover for missions my brother doesn't even have the clearance to know exist, and tonight's humiliation was the final cut. They think I'm weak, but they're about to meet the real me. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if a loved one's words have ever felt like a knife to the heart, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, because this story of hidden truths and reclaimed justice is for you. The air in our family's log cabin in Colorado Springs was thick with the comforting trinity of Thanksgiving, the rich scent of roasting turkey, the sweet spice of my mother's pumpkin pie, and the dry heat of a roaring fireplace. It was supposed to feel like coming home, but for me, it just felt like walking onto a stage where I didn't know my lines. I tried. I moved through the familiar rooms, asking my aunt about her new grandchild, complimenting my cousin on his recent promotion. The answers were always polite, but short. They were verbal dead ends, forcing me to retreat and try another route, only to find it blocked as well. Earlier, I'd arrived with a gift for my parents. It was a handcrafted whiskey decanter set, engraved with my father's old Army unit crest. Expensive, thoughtful. I'd spent weeks finding it. My mother smiled that tight, distant smile of hers and placed it on a side table in the corner, where it was quickly obscured by a pile of winter coats. It was a small thing, but it was the opening act in a play I knew all too well. I found my father by the fireplace, his back ramrod straight even in retirement. My brother, Connor, stood beside him, the two of them looking like a recruitment poster brought to life. "Dad," I started, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "Did you see the Broncos game last weekend? That last-minute field goal was unbelievable." My father gave a single, dismissive nod, his eyes never leaving Connor. Unbelievable is right. Poor discipline on the defensive line. He then turned his full attention to my brother. "Now, what you were saying about the new amphibious assault tactics? That's where real strategy lies." And just like that, I was erased. I was a ghost at the feast, a shadow in my own home. The isolation wasn't born from silence. It was crafted from 1,000 tiny interactions that screamed, I didn't belong. I wasn't part of their world, their warrior class. I was just the civilian daughter with the logistics job, the one who didn't measure up. The climax arrived, as it always did, when my father stood to give his toast. The clinking of silverware quieted. All eyes, my aunts, uncles, cousins, all the faces I'd known my entire life, turned to him. He held his wineglass, the liquid shimmering in the firelight, and he began. He spoke of family, of tradition, of gratitude. And then his gaze locked on Connor, shining with a pride he never showed me. "I am a fortunate man," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "I have a son who carries on the Hansen legacy with honor, a major in the United States Marine Corps." He paused, letting the weight of the title settle in the room. Then, his eyes flickered to me for a fraction of a second, just long enough to deliver the killing blow. "To Connor," he declared. "At least one of my children understands what real service to this country means. A son who brings honor, not a daughter who quits for some meaningless desk job." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy as shrapnel. A profound silence fell over the dinner table. No one moved. No one spoke. I looked at my mother, pleading with my eyes for her to say something, to defend me. She just looked back, her face a mask of pity. And that look, that silent, sorrowful pity, hurt more than my father's public execution. It confirmed his judgment. Connor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a flicker of embarrassment on his face, but he said nothing. He never did. The collective silence of my family was their verdict. I was an outsider, a disappointment. My training kicked in. The years of discipline that taught me to compartmentalize pain, to control every physical reaction. There were no tears. There was no outburst. That would only prove their point. With deliberate, steady hands, I placed my fork and knife together on my plate. I leaned forward slightly and whispered to no one in particular, "Excuse me, I'm not feeling well." I pushed my chair back and stood. Every eye in the room followed me, a silent, curious herd. No one asked me to stay. No one asked if I was okay. As I walked out of the warm dining room and stepped onto the back deck, the biting cold of the November night wrapped around me. The door swung shut behind me, but not before I heard my mother's voice, laced with weary resignation, drift out into the darkness. "She's always been so sensitive." That single sentence was the final twist of the knife. My hurt wasn't valid, it was a character flaw. My pain was simply me being sensitive. Standing there under a vast, star-filled Colorado sky, I didn't feel the cold on my skin. All I felt was a hollow, shattering emptiness inside. A kind of brokenness that no combat mission, no physical danger had ever inflicted. Then I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. The screen glowed with a single, encrypted text. "Ghost, we have movement." It was my real world, my real name. The world where I wasn't a disappointment, but a commander. A world where I was respected, needed, and lethal. The brutal contrast between the warm prison of that house and the cold freedom of that message made something inside me snap. I looked back through the window at the cozy family scene, a perfect picture of belonging from which I had just been brutally cut. Then I looked down at the glowing screen in my hand, where a mission, a duty, was waiting. The sadness that had been choking me for hours suddenly evaporated. In its place, a cold, hard resolve settled in my bones. It felt like steel. They wanted me to be a shadow. Fine, I would show them the power a shadow can wield. My fingers moved quickly across the screen, my reply short and precise. "Copy. En route." I hit send and turned my back on the house, stepping away from the light and into the deep, welcoming darkness. I left them all behind. The twin beams of my truck's headlights cut through the Colorado darkness, the only light for miles on the empty stretch of highway leading to the base. The cold fury that had propelled me out of my parents' house was beginning to fade, replaced by the familiar, heavy ache of memory. My father's words from tonight weren't a new wound. They were just salt poured into old ones. As the miles disappeared under my tires, the past began to unspool. Each memory a piece of the map that showed exactly how I'd ended up here. It started with West Point. I can still feel the summer sun on my face on graduation day, the perfect rows of gray uniforms on the parade ground, the weight of 4 years of relentless effort finally culminating in that moment. I hadn't just survived the academy, I had excelled. I graduated at the top of my class in physical readiness, my academic record pristine. I had given it everything I had. In the family photo we took afterward, my face is beaming, my uniform crisp, my future limitless. My father stood next to me, a proud military patriarch. But he didn't hug me. He placed a firm, formal hand on my shoulder, a gesture of ownership more than affection. "Good work," he'd said, his voice low and serious. "This is just the beginning. Don't disappoint me." There was no praise for the brutal path I'd walked to get there, no acknowledgement of the fact I'd outperformed his own record from 30 years prior. Just a new, heavier expectation laid upon my shoulders. I remember 2 years later when Connor finished his 13 weeks of basic training at Paris Island. He wasn't a commissioned officer, he was a newly minted Marine. And my father threw him a party. The whole extended family was there, a banner hanging in the backyard that read, "Congratulations, Marine." My father gave a booming speech about honor and commitment, his arm slung proudly around Connor's shoulders. That's when I finally understood the rules of the game. For me, success was a mandatory requirement. For Connor, it was a reason to celebrate. The highway stretched on, and another memory surfaced, this one sharper, more bitter. It was the day I came home to lie to them. I had just been recruited into Delta Force, the most elite and secretive unit in the U.S. military. The selection process was the single hardest thing I had ever done. A brutal crucible designed to break the strongest soldiers. I had made it. But the cover story was my exit. I walked into the living room, a real gash on my forearm from a training exercise hidden under a loose bandage, my excuse ready. My parents were sitting on the couch, waiting. I took a breath. "I think I'm going to be leaving the service," I said, the words feeling like poison on my tongue. I watched my father's face. I saw the pride he held for me, already so fragile, completely crumble. It wasn't a look of concern. It was a look of profound disappointment. He didn't ask about the bandage on my arm. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the mountains, his back to me. "I thought you were made of different stuff," he said, his voice flat and final. I was wrong. My mother started to cry. Not for me, not for any pain I might be in, but for the shame my decision would bring. The shame of a daughter who couldn't hack it. I had to sit there and swallow it all. I had to accept the role of the coward to protect them, to protect a secret they would never know. I was sacrificing my public honor for a silent, deadly one, and in their eyes, I was nothing but a failure. But the oldest wound, the one that taught me the fundamental lesson of my father's world, was much smaller. I was 10 years old, and the center of my universe was a German shepherd named Major. He was my confidant, my shadow, my one source of unwavering affection. I'd race home from school every day just to see him, his big, goofy grin and wildly wagging tail. One afternoon, I came home, and the backyard was empty. The silence was deafening. I found my father in his study, polishing his boots. "Where's Major?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't look up. "I gave him to a family on a farm," he said, his tone clinical. "He wouldn't obey commands consistently. He was too soft." I cried for a week, but through the tears, a cold, hard lesson took root in my 10-year-old heart. In my father's world, love was conditional. Affection was a reward for performance, and anything, or anyone, that didn't meet his exacting, unforgiving standards was simply removed. Major, with his soft heart and loving nature, had been deemed defective. That dog became a symbol of my own deepest fear, that one day I too would be deemed too soft, too disobedient, and be cast aside. Tonight, it felt like that day had finally come. Back in the truck, all these memories crashed together, the dismissal, the disappointment, the disposal. A wave of raw, uncensored fury surged through me. I had sacrificed everything, my name, my public identity, the right to share my victories and my pain with the people who were supposed to love me most, and my reward was contempt. My fist slammed into the steering wheel, a sharp crack in the silence of the cab. It was a rare loss of control, a crack in the icy discipline that defined my life. What did I do all this for? I asked the empty road, my voice raw. To protect people who don't even respect me? The road ahead was a black ribbon disappearing into nothing. For the first time, I felt truly lost. Not on a map, but in my own life. I knew I couldn't keep living this way, split between two worlds, belonging in neither. The silent soldier and the disappointing daughter. A question, heavy and terrifying, echoed in the emptiness. So what do I do now? The question, so what do I do now, didn't get an answer. It just hung in the air as I drove, eventually dissolving into the sheer exhaustion of my double life. The next morning, the path forward wasn't a grand strategy for liberation. It was just the soul-crushing routine of my cover job. At 8 a.m., I was Sienna Hansen, supply chain manager. I sat in a gray cubicle under the sickening hum of fluorescent lights that always gave me a headache. The air smelled of stale coffee and microwave popcorn. My boss, Gary, a man whose greatest physical exertion was getting out of his office chair, strolled over to my desk. He had a paunch that strained the buttons of his shirt and a condescending smirk permanently fixed on his face. He slapped a thick stack of invoices on my desk, making my monitor tremble. "Sienna," he said, leaning in conspiratorially, his voice a little too loud. "I need these reports reconciled by morning. Top priority." He then tapped the corner of my desk. "And try to smile a little more, would you? Nobody wants to work with a grump." I just nodded, my eyes fixed on the spreadsheet in front of me, my jaw tight. The urge to explain that my grumpy face was the result of chronic sleep deprivation and the constant crushing weight of national security secrets was overwhelming. But I just said, "Yes, Gary, I'm on it." He patted my shoulder with a self-satisfied grunt and walked away. I stared at his back, feeling a profound, soul-deep weariness. This was my penance. This was the price of being a ghost. 12 hours later, the scene shifted. The fluorescent lights were gone, replaced by the green, grainy glow of night vision. The stale office air was replaced by the dust and grit of a nameless village somewhere in the Middle East. I was no longer Sienna Hansen, the grumpy office worker. I was Colonel Hansen. I was Ghost. My face was streaked with grime and sweat, my body encased in tactical gear. The stack of invoices was replaced by a satellite map displaying the heat signatures of my team moving silently through the alleys below. "Bravo 1, this is Ghost." I spoke into my comms unit, my voice low, calm, and absolute. "Target is on the second floor, northeast corner. I have you covered. Execute on my mark." The contrast was so brutal, so jarring, it felt like it could tear a person in two. To go from being patronized by a man like Gary to holding the lives of a dozen elite soldiers in my hands was a daily exercise in psychological whiplash. This was the tightrope I walked. This was my lonely road. The exhaustion followed me home. At the end of a grueling week, 3 days buried in logistics reports and 2 sleepless nights coordinating a cross-border operation, all I wanted was my own bed. But my old pickup truck had other plans. On a desolate stretch of I-25, with the light snow beginning to fall, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Complete silence. I coasted to the shoulder, the vast empty plains of Colorado stretching out around me. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. Just a pathetic click. My phone had 2 bars of service. I had 2 choices. I could call my father, who would undoubtedly launch into a lecture about my lack of foresight and failure to properly maintain equipment. Or I could call Connor, who would offer a series of overly cheerful, condescendingly simple suggestions, as if I hadn't already checked the battery terminals. So, I called neither. I called a tow truck. An hour later, sitting in the freezing cab of the tow rig, I watched the snow fall on my dead truck as it was loaded onto the flatbed. The repair bill came to just under $1,000, a significant chunk of my carefully saved civilian salary. It was a problem I had to solve entirely on my own, another secret expense, another burden I couldn't share. As other cars sped past, their headlights illuminating the swirling snow, a wave of profound loneliness washed over me. It was so intense, it was hard to breathe. Even the most mundane struggles of life, I had to face them utterly and completely alone. In that cold, dark moment, feeling the full weight of my isolation, my mind drifted back. I closed my eyes and I was a young cadet at West Point again, sitting in an auditorium, listening to a speech by General Ann Dunwoody. She was the first woman in U.S. history to achieve the rank of 4-star general, a living legend. I remembered her standing at the podium, radiating a quiet, unshakable strength. "I never thought about being the first woman," she'd said. "I just thought about being the best officer I could be." Those words, stored away for years, came back to me then with the force of a revelation. It was like a jolt of electricity to my exhausted soul. That was it. That was my purpose. This crushing loneliness, the humiliating desk job, the secret sacrifices, they were all part of the cost. The cost of being the best officer I could be, the best ghost I could be. The memory didn't erase the sadness, but it forged it into something harder. It reinforced my resolve. I would endure. A week later, that resolve paid off. The intelligence we gathered from that village raid led to the disruption of a major terrorist plot, saving dozens, maybe hundreds, of innocent lives. It was a clean, flawless victory. And I returned from it to my small, rented apartment. There was no parade, no welcome home party. My dinner was a cup of instant noodles I ate standing over the sink. Later, I sat alone in the quiet darkness of my living room, the only light coming from a street lamp outside my window. I methodically stripped, cleaned, and reassembled my rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. The cold, polished steel felt solid and real in my hands, a stark contrast to the emptiness of the room. Its cold surface reflected my own impassive face. This was my victory, a triumph no one would ever know about, a glory I couldn't share. I set the rifle down, its deadly purpose fulfilled for now. I looked around the bare, impersonal room, the cheap furniture, the empty walls. And I felt the silence closing in, the crushing weight of a life lived entirely in the shadows. If you've ever achieved something you were incredibly proud of but had no one to share it with, hit the like button. And in the comments, just type the word victory for all those silent battles you've won on your own. The walls of my own loneliness felt like they were squeezing the very air from my lungs. The loneliness of my apartment became unbearable. After weeks of living in that hollow silence, punctuated only by the demands of two separate secret lives, I knew I had to do something. Anything. So one Saturday morning, instead of letting the four walls of my apartment close in on me, I forced myself to go to a local coffee shop. It was a small act of defiance against the emptiness. The place was warm and smelled of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. I found a small table in the corner, content to just be around the gentle hum of other people's lives. Across the room, a group of older men sat around a large table, laughing and swapping stories. They all wore baseball caps, each one a badge of honor. Vietnam veteran, Desert Storm, Semper Fi. It was a classic Vets Coffee meetup, a common sight in a military town like Colorado Springs. They were a band of brothers, a tribe. I watched them with a pang of longing, feeling like I was on the outside of yet another world I should have belonged to. I was stirring my coffee when one of them got up and started walking toward my table. He was an older gentleman with a neatly trimmed silver beard and kind, crinkling eyes that seemed to have seen a great deal. My first instinct was to tense up, to put my guard on, but there was a gentleness in his approach that disarmed me. "Excuse me for bothering you, ma'am," he said, his voice a soft, gravelly rumble. "My name's Frank. I just couldn't help but notice the way you sit. Your posture? You carry yourself like a soldier. Did you serve?" His question was direct, but there was no judgment in it. No expectation. Just a genuine, respectful curiosity. It was so different from the way my own family talked about my service, either with impossible standards or dismissive contempt. I was taken aback by his perception. "I was in the Army, yes," I said simply, offering no more. Frank, a retired Marine Master Sergeant who'd served in Vietnam, just nodded slowly, as if that was all the explanation he needed. He didn't ask for my rank, my unit, or why I got out. He didn't pry for war stories. Instead, he pulled up a chair and began to talk about his own experience, about the feeling of coming home to a world that no longer made sense. "The hardest part isn't the noise of the fighting," he said, his gaze distant for a moment. "It's the silence afterward. You come back, and you feel like you're speaking a language that nobody understands." As I listened to him, a knot of tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying began to loosen inside my chest. For the first time, someone understood a piece of my burden without me having to reveal a single classified detail. He didn't see Sienna Hansen, the logistics manager. He saw the soldier. The part of me my own father had refused to see, even when I was in uniform. A little while later, a warm, energetic woman with a bright smile and salt and pepper hair came into the coffee shop. She walked right up to our table and kissed Frank on the cheek. "There you are," she said, before turning her warm gaze on me. "And who is this?" "Maria, this is Sienna," Frank said. "Sienna, my wife. Maria." Maria's eyes were just as kind as her husband's. She took my hand in both of hers, her skin warm and soft. "It's so wonderful to meet you, dear." She looked me up and down. not with scrutiny, but with a kind of maternal appraisal. Then, without a moment's hesitation, she said, "Frank and I are having my Sunday lasagna tomorrow. We always make too much. You have to come." Our house, 5 o'clock. I make the best lasagna in all of Colorado, I promise. I started to politely decline, the habit of isolation being a hard one to break. But the sincerity in her smile was so genuine, so insistent, that I found myself agreeing before I could stop myself. That Sunday dinner was the polar opposite of my family's Thanksgiving. Frank and Maria's house was small and modest, but it was filled with laughter and the incredible aroma of garlic, oregano, and simmering tomatoes. There were no expectations, no performances. They didn't ask about my career or my accomplishments. They asked what music I liked. They asked if I'd ever hiked the trails at Garden of the Gods. They told me funny stories about their grandchildren. They simply listened. To them, I wasn't Colonel Hanson, the secret warrior. And I wasn't Sienna Hanson, the disappointing daughter. I was just Sienna. And that was enough. After dinner, the three of us sat out on their back porch with tall glasses of iced tea, watching the sun dip below the magnificent silhouette of Pikes Peak. The sky bled into shades of orange, pink, and deep purple. A comfortable silence settled between us, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. It was a peace I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. When it was time for me to leave, Maria walked me to my truck. Before I could get in, she pulled me into a hug. It wasn't a polite, air kiss on the cheek kind of hug. It was a real, warm, motherly embrace that felt like coming home. She held me for a moment and then whispered in my ear, "You are a good girl, Sienna. This door's always open for you, anytime. You hear me?" Her simple words and the unconditional warmth of that hug did something to me that years of military discipline and emotional suppression couldn't defend against. The thick wall of ice I had built around my heart began to crack. Driving away from their little house with the taste of homemade lasagna still on my tongue and the feeling of a mother's embrace still warming my shoulders, I realized something profound. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel like a soldier or a failure. I felt like I had a place to belong. That simple feeling of peace, of being seen and loved for exactly who I was worth more than any medal I'd ever earned in secret. The weeks that followed were a quiet revelation. I found myself spending every weekend at Frank and Maria's house, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to be there. I helped Frank in his garden, my hands in the soil, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. I learned Maria's secret recipe for tomato sauce. We'd sit on the porch for hours, talking about everything and nothing. They built a space for me in their lives, a safe harbor where I could just be Sienna. For the first time in months, I felt the tight, relentless knot of tension in my shoulders begin to ease. I was starting to feel happy. Then the phone rang. It was a Saturday afternoon. The three of us were in the backyard, laughing as we tried to assemble a new bird feeder that was proving more complicated than any military hardware I'd ever handled. My phone buzzed on the patio table. I glanced at the screen. "Mom." The laughter died in my throat. My entire body went on high alert, a cold wave of dread washing away the afternoon's warmth. Frank and Maria, sensing the immediate shift in my demeanor, fell silent. They gave me a knowing, gentle look and quietly moved to another part of the yard, giving me space. I took a breath and answered. "Hi, Mom." "Sienna, darling, how are you?" Her voice was like honey, a sweet, syrupy tone she only ever used when she wanted something. It was a weaponized pleasantry, and my internal alarm screamed, "Red flag, red flag." "Calm down, Sienna," I told myself. "Maybe this time is different. Maybe she's just calling to see how you are." "I'm fine, Mom. Just enjoying the weekend. What's up?" "Oh, nothing much, just thinking of you," she cooed. The lie was so blatant it was almost insulting. We went through a few minutes of hollow pleasantries, the weather, her garden club, a cousin's new baby. It was all a preamble, the circling of a predator before the strike. Finally, she got to it. "So, honey, your brother Connor is applying for a highly competitive advanced tactics course. It's a huge step for his career. really prestigious. That's great, I said, my voice carefully neutral. I knew what was coming next. Well, here, your father wants to talk to you, she said. And then the line shuffled. My father's voice came on, stripped of the open contempt from Thanksgiving, but replaced with something almost worse, a thinly veiled command disguised as a casual request. Sienna, he began, I hear your company does some contract work with suppliers for the base where Connor's course is held. I need you to use your connections. See if you can emphasize his application file. It would be a good way for you to contribute to the family for once. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I was stunned into silence. This meaningless desk job, the one he had publicly humiliated me for, was suddenly a valuable tool now that it could serve his golden son. The bitter irony burned in my throat. My work was worthless until it was useful to them. I was worthless until I was useful to them. I found my voice, trying to keep it steady. Dad, that's not how it works. It would be improper. The reaction was immediate and coordinated, a practiced two-front assault. My mother snatched the phone back, her honeyed voice instantly replaced by the sound of manufactured tears. Sienna, this is your brother's future we're talking about. Can't you just do this one thing for your family? After everything we've done for you, raised you, given you... Her voice trailed off into a sob, heavy with guilt. Then, my father's voice cut in from the background, cold and sharp as ice. Stop pretending to have principles, Sienna. I know what your kind of corporate work is like. Just get it done. Don't disappoint this family any further. And there it was. The emotional blackmail, the guilt trip, the command. They weren't asking. They were ordering, using my own sense of duty and my desperate, stupid hope for their approval as leverage. They had me cornered, just like they always did. I felt the familiar exhaustion wash over me, the sheer weariness of fighting a battle I could never win. Arguing was pointless. It would only lead to more accusations, more tears, more lectures. So I surrendered. Okay, I said, my voice flat, mechanical. I'll see what I can do. The relief on the other end of the line was palpable. Oh, thank you, darling. We knew we could count on you, my mother chirped, her tears miraculously gone. I hung up without saying goodbye, my hand trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. The beautiful, peaceful afternoon had been poisoned. I stood there, staring at the half-assembled bird feeder, feeling the fragile walls of my newfound happiness crumble around me. Frank walked over, his expression full of a quiet understanding. He didn't ask what the call was about. He just placed a firm, steady hand on my shoulder. You don't owe anyone anything, kiddo, he said softly. Especially not your own peace of mind. His words broke the dam. Tears I hadn't shed on Thanksgiving, tears I hadn't shed in years, suddenly streamed down my face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage, a white-hot anger at them, and at myself for falling for it yet again. In that moment, I saw the truth with devastating clarity. They would never change. My father would never respect me. My mother would never protect me. To them, I would always be a tool, a means to an end, an instrument to be used for Connor's benefit and then put back in the box. And I was so tired of being their tool. A few weeks later, my phone rang. It was my mother again, her voice bubbling with a manufactured cheerfulness that set my teeth on edge. Sienna, great news. Connor got accepted into the program. We are just so proud of him. She paused, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she formulated the bait. Your father and I want to take everyone out to dinner on Saturday night to celebrate, to the Penrose Room at the Broadmoor. And we want to thank you too for your help. You absolutely have to be there. The Penrose Room, the fanciest restaurant in Colorado Springs, and those two little words, thank you. A pathetic, weak part of me, a part I thought I had buried, flickered to life, a tiny ember of hope. I hated myself for it. I knew it was a trap. I knew it was a performance. But what if it wasn't? What if this was the moment things finally changed? I told myself it was the last chance, the very last one. So, against all my better judgment, I agreed. On Saturday night, I did something I rarely do. I put on a dress, a simple, elegant black one. I put on makeup. I tried to look the part of a daughter they could be proud of, just for one night. The moment I stepped into the restaurant, I knew I'd made a mistake. The Penrose room was opulent, all dark wood, crystal chandeliers, and panoramic views of the city lights. And at a large prominent table in the center of the room sat my family. But it wasn't just them. My father had invited two of his business partners and their wives. A full-bird colonel and his wife from Fort Carson were there too. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a showcase. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach as I took my seat. The evening unfolded exactly as I'd feared. The conversation was a steady, relentless stream of praise directed at Connor, his achievements, his potential, his brilliant future. I was a spectator at my brother's coronation. My name was mentioned only once. It was my mother who said it, a casual, dismissive wave of her hand as she spoke to the colonel's wife. Oh, and we were so lucky Sienna was able to help out with some of the logistics paperwork. Such a help. She made it sound like I had run a few errands, like I'd picked up their dry cleaning. She reduced my efforts, the careful, ethical tightrope I had walked for them, into a trivial administrative task. In that moment, I saw my role with perfect clarity. I wasn't the guest of honor. I wasn't even a guest. I was a prop. A footnote in their grand play brought out to prove what a supportive, wonderful family they were. But the final, unforgivable act was yet to come. After the main course, my father stood up, clinking his glass for attention. The table fell silent. He began a grand speech about the Hanson family's legacy of military service, a tradition of honor passed down through generations. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small, worn velvet box. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I knew that box. This was my father's West Point ring, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He opened the box, revealing the heavy gold ring inside. It belongs to the one most worthy of carrying on our family's legacy. I stopped breathing. I was a West Point graduate, top of my class. By every rule of tradition and merit, that ring should have been mine. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, stupid hope fighting against the inevitable. My father started to walk around the table. He approached my side. For a single, insane second, I thought he was going to stop. But he didn't even look at me. He walked right past me, his shadow falling over me for a moment, and stopped beside Connor. He placed the velvet box in my brother's hand. "Wear it with pride, son," he said, his voice choked with emotion. A true Marine. The world shattered. For a split second, there was nothing but a roaring in my ears. Then, all the broken pieces of my life, all the years of silent endurance, of being invisible, of swallowing my pain, came back together. Not as a heart, but as a single, solid block of ice in my chest. The years of silence were over. Slowly, deliberately, I rose to my feet. Every conversation in the restaurant seemed to fade away. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. I could feel every eye at the table on me. My voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It wasn't hysterical. It was the calm, clear, and steady voice of a commander on the battlefield. The voice I used to send men into the fire. "Congratulations, Connor," I said, looking at my brother. Then I turned my head and locked my eyes directly on my father. "You were right, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "That ring belongs to the one who carries on the family legacy." I held his stunned gaze. And I finally understand today that I'm not part of that legacy, and I don't want to be. My gaze swept across the entire table, over the shocked faces of my mother, the guests, everyone. Thank you all for making that perfectly clear. This will be my last dinner with you. With that, I placed my cloth napkin neatly on the table. If you have ever had a moment where you finally stood up for yourself after years of silence, hit that like button. And if you believe that speaking your truth is the ultimate act of courage, comment "I stand" below. I turned my back on them all. I walked away, my spine straight, my head held high. I did not look back once, leaving behind a table of stunned silence and the wreckage of a family I no longer claimed. After walking out of the Penrose room, I didn't go home. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still coursing through me, too potent for the confines of my apartment. Instinct took over. I drove, heading up the winding roads of Cheyenne Mountain until I found a scenic overlook. From there, the lights of Colorado Springs glittered below like a fallen constellation. I killed the engine and sat in the silence, the chill of the night air seeping into the cab. The white-hot rage from the restaurant began to cool, crystallizing into something else. A cold, diamond-hard clarity. The emotional war was over. Now, the strategic one began. For my entire career, I had fought for others in the shadows, for my country, for my unit, even for the family that scorned me. Now, for the first time, I was going to fight for myself, and I was going to do it in the light. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was messy, emotional. This was about truth. It was a tactical operation, and it required a plan. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small government-issue notebook and a pen. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I began to write, the way I would plan a mission deep in enemy territory. Objective, liberation. Enemy, the lie. Assets, classified. Risks, career, professional standing, total alienation. End state, truth. I mapped out potential scenarios, contingencies, escalation of force. It was familiar territory. The chaos of my personal life finally clicked into a framework I could understand and control. I wasn't the broken daughter anymore. I was the mission commander. And every commander knows the first step is to secure your allies. I didn't drive home. I drove to Frank and Maria's. The lights were still on. When Frank opened the door, he took one look at my face and simply stepped aside to let me in. He didn't ask questions. Maria was in the kitchen, and she immediately put a kettle on the stove. They guided me to the kitchen table, the same one where I'd shared lasagna and laughter, and let me sit in silence until I was ready. I didn't tell them the classified parts of my life. I couldn't. But I told them the truth of my pain. I told them about the dinner, the toast, the ring. They disowned me tonight, Frank, I said, my voice quiet but steady. They looked right through me and made it clear I'm not, and never will be, a part of their family. They crossed a line they can't uncross. Frank listened, his kind eyes never leaving my face. He let me pour out all the hurt and humiliation without a single interruption. When I was finished, he just nodded slowly. He stood up, poured hot water over a tea bag in a mug, and slid it in front of me. Then, he sat back down. So, he said, his voice the calm rumble of an old warrior. What's the mission, soldier? The simple, powerful validation in that question hit me harder than any expression of sympathy could have. He saw me. He heard the commander under the pain. He wasn't offering advice or pity. He was asking for his orders. He was asking how he could help. That was all the reinforcement I needed. Back in my apartment later that night, the reality of my plan began to sink in. I sat on my couch, staring at the blank wall, and a cold sliver of fear pierced through my resolve. My plan was audacious. If I wasn't careful, if I miscalculated, I could be violating a dozen security protocols. My career, the only thing I truly had, could be over. I could be reprimanded, demoted, even discharged. I could lose everything. The fear was real, a cold knot in my stomach. Just as the doubt began to creep in, my mind snagged on something. A memory of a YouTube video I'd watched late one night, a TED Talk by Brené Brown. Her voice echoed in my head, clear as day. Vulnerability is not winning or losing, she'd said. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. The words struck me like a physical blow. The courage to show up and be seen. I had spent my entire adult life being unseen, hiding in the safety of secrecy, in the shadows. It had protected my missions, but it had starved my soul. I had to show up. I had to be seen, even if I couldn't control the outcome. My weapon in this fight wasn't a rifle. It was the truth. But the truth, spoken by me, was just a daughter's bitter accusation. To be effective, it needed to be verified. It needed to be delivered by an authority so absolute, so unimpeachable, that it could not be questioned or dismissed. After hours of weighing the risks against the cost of doing nothing, I made the boldest decision of my life. I walked over to my desk and powered on a laptop. It wasn't my civilian computer. This one was hardened, secure, and connected to a world my family didn't know existed. I opened a secure communications channel and scrolled through a list of contacts that were nothing more than encrypted call signs. I stopped at one. Harper Gen R, General Harper, my former commanding officer, the man who had personally recruited me into the program, the man who gave me the name Ghost. He knew my value. He knew the truth. My finger hovered over the call button, a slight tremor in my hand. This was the point of no return. Pushing this button was the equivalent of arming a bomb. There would be no going back. I took one slow, deep breath, Brené Brown's words echoing in my mind. The courage to show up. I pressed the button. The line connected almost instantly, the silence on the other end heavy with authority. General Harper, sir, I said, my voice clear and firm. This is Ghost. I need your help. The next day, I made a call. I requested an emergency family meeting at my parents' house. I kept the reason brief and professional. It's about my professional future, I told my mother, knowing those words would be both intriguing and alarming enough to guarantee their attendance. I arrived 5 minutes early. I didn't pace. I didn't fidget. I simply sat on the familiar living room sofa, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I was a commander in a holding pattern before an assault. My heart beat a slow, steady drum. My mother was fluttering around the room, nervously adjusting picture frames. She could sense something was different in my demeanor, and it made her anxious. My father and Connor, however, walked in radiating smug satisfaction. They strolled into the living room like conquering heroes, assuming I had come to beg for forgiveness, to apologize for my little scene at the restaurant. They thought they had taught me a lesson. The air in the room was thick with their condescension. It was a suffocating, familiar feeling. So, what's this all about, Sienna? My father started, taking his usual armchair, the throne from which he passed judgment. Are you ready to behave like an adult now? Connor smirked from his position by the fireplace, leaning against the mantelpiece as if he owned it. He was wearing the West Point ring. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. A sharp, clear chime that cut through the tension. I stood up. Are you expecting someone? My father grumbled, annoyed at the interruption. I didn't answer. I walked to the front door, my steps measured and silent. I turned the handle and pulled it open. Standing on the porch was General Mark Harper. He was not in civilian clothes. He was wearing his full Class A dress uniform. The 4 silver stars of a full general glittered on each shoulder. A rainbow of ribbons, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, Purple Hearts, was arranged immaculately on his chest. He was, at that moment, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. He was a force of nature in human form. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if a vacuum had sucked all the air, all the arrogance, out of the room. My father, James Hansen, a retired colonel, shot to his feet. It wasn't a choice, it was a reflex. Decades of military discipline hardwired into his bones. His back went ramrod straight, his hands instinctively flattening at his sides. The smug look on his face was replaced by one of pure, slack-jawed shock. Connor simply stared, his mouth hanging open. His eyes were glued to the 4 stars on General Harper's shoulders, his own bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. The shiny gold ring on his finger suddenly looked like a cheap toy. General Harper didn't need an introduction, but he offered one anyway. He stepped inside, his presence filling the entire house. He gave a curt, professional nod to my father and brother. Colonel Hansen, Major Hansen. Then, he turned to me. The look in his eyes changed. The hardness softened into something I recognized immediately. Profound, unwavering respect. Colonel Hansen, he said, and his voice, calm but carrying the immense weight of his command, echoed in the stunned silence. Thank you for the invitation. The word colonel hung in the air, a sonic boom that shook the very foundations of my family's reality. I saw the confusion, the utter disbelief, flash across my father's face. General Harper then turned his attention back to my father. "Colonel," he began, addressing him as a peer but with an authority that was galaxies beyond his. "I'm here today in a personal capacity, at the request of one of the finest officers I have ever had the privilege of commanding." He didn't reveal state secrets. He didn't need to. He spoke in broad, powerful strokes that painted a picture more vivid than any classified file. He spoke of silent missions in places the evening news would never mention. He spoke of a courage demonstrated in the dark, far from any parade ground. He spoke of a living legend within the special operations community, an operative known only by a call sign. He spoke of Ghost. Finally, he brought his gaze back to my father, pinning him in place. "Colonel," General Harper said, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its power. "A soldier's legacy isn't measured by the rank on their shoulders. It's measured by the sacrifices they make. Your daughter has sacrificed more for this country than you and I together could ever comprehend. This nation owes her a debt that can never be repaid." With the finality of a judge's gavel, he finished. He stepped toward me, took my hand in a firm, respectful handshake, and said, "It was good to see you, Sienna." He then gave one last nod to my speechless family and walked out the door. The click of the latch closing was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It left behind a silence that was heavier, more profound than any explosion. My father, James, seemed to deflate. He sank back into his armchair, not with the authority of a king, but with the dead weight of a broken man. His face was ashen, the color of old paper. In the space of 5 minutes, he looked as if he had aged 20 years. My mother, Margaret, finally broke. She let out a choked sob, collapsing into a weeping mess on the sofa. But these were not the performative tears of emotional blackmail. These were the gut-wrenching sobs of shame and regret. And Connor just stared at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror and a strange, new kind of awe. "Ghost?" he stammered, the name barely a whisper. You're the ghost? The legend?" I stood there, in the center of the wreckage. I felt no triumph, no smug satisfaction, just a quiet, terrifying calm. I looked at the man who had been my father, the man who had judged me, dismissed me, and erased me. I spoke one final sentence, my voice perfectly level. "Now," I said, "shall we talk as equals, Colonel?" The explosion from that afternoon in my parents' living room didn't end with a clean silence. It kicked up a storm. In the days that followed, my phone became a relentless source of emotional shrapnel. My mother called constantly, her voice choked with frantic, weeping apologies. They were long, rambling messages filled with phrases like, "I never knew," and "I am so, so sorry, Sienna." But they felt hollow, like the confessions of a stranger. They were apologies for being caught, not for the crime itself. Connor sent a barrage of text messages. They were long paragraphs, a clumsy mixture of awe, admiration, and deep, profound shame. He kept calling me a legend, a hero, as if trying on new words to describe a sister he never knew. It was overwhelming and honestly, exhausting. But the one person I needed to hear from, the one whose voice mattered most in the wreckage, was silent. My father. For 3 days, nothing. And his silence once again spoke volumes. It was a familiar, painful language. It told me that even now, with the truth laid bare by a 4-star general, he still didn't know how to face me. He didn't know how to navigate the emotional terrain of his own failure as a father. On the 4th day, he finally called. His voice on the other end was rough, gravelly, as if he hadn't used it in days. There was no preamble, no apology. Just a single, gruff sentence. "Meet me at Garden of the Gods, the central parking lot." Then he hung up. I found him sitting on a park bench overlooking the iconic red sandstone formations, stark and beautiful against the brilliant blue Colorado sky. I sat down beside him, leaving a careful foot of space between us. For a long time, we just sat there, two soldiers in civilian clothes, watching the tourists take pictures. He didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "I was wrong," he finally said, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. "There's no excuse for it. I was a terrible father." And there they were. The words I had spent a lifetime starving to hear. The validation I had craved more than any medal, any promotion. But now that they had arrived, they didn't bring the sweet relief I had always imagined. There was no rush of joy, no feeling of victory. Just a deep, profound, and aching sadness. I had won. But the price of winning was the utter destruction of the hero I had once worshipped. The man sitting next to me wasn't the giant from my childhood. He was just a flawed, stubborn old man who had broken the most important thing he had ever been entrusted with. I took a long, slow breath, the dry, clean air filling my lungs. "I hear you, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "And I appreciate you saying it. More than you know." I turned to look at his profile, forcing him to feel the weight of my gaze. "But you need to understand something. The daughter who spent her entire life trying to win your approval, she's gone. She died in that restaurant the other night." I let the words hang in the air between us. If we're going to have any kind of relationship moving forward, it starts over, from scratch. It will be based on respect, not expectation, and it will be on my terms. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to say to him. It wasn't a rejection, but it was a declaration of independence. I was defining the new terms of engagement. He didn't respond, just gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning, a truce. My relationship with Connor, however, began to heal in a completely different way. He showed up at my apartment a week later, looking nervous and uncertain. He didn't come with a flood of apologies. He came with a request. "Tell me," he said, his voice sincere in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Not about the missions. I don't have the clearance, and that's not what I mean. Tell me what it was like. For you, I want to understand." So, for the first time in our lives, we talked. Not as the golden son and the forgotten daughter, but as two adults, two fellow soldiers. I didn't give him classified details, but I told him about the loneliness. I told him about the crushing weight of the secrets, the exhaustion of the double life, the quiet humiliation of my cover job. He listened. He truly listened. He admitted his own ignorance, his own quiet jealousies growing up, the way he had blindly accepted our father's narrative without question. He talked about the pressure he felt to always be the perfect son, the perfect Marine. The wall that had stood between us for 35 years, built brick by brick with favoritism and misunderstanding, began to crumble. In its place, we started to build a bridge, fragile at first, but real. A connection forged not in shared blood, but in shared truth. It was a different kind of victory, a quiet one, but it felt just as important as the one I had fought for in my parents' living room. The war was over, but now came the long, complicated work of surveying the damage and deciding what, if anything, was worth rebuilding. Rebuilding a life isn't like reassembling a rifle. There's no manual. It's a slow, quiet process of choosing what to keep, what to discard, and what to build anew. The 7 years that followed that confrontation were my construction project. Today, at 42, my world is very different. I'm Major General Sienna Hansen, commanding a specialized unit out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The work is demanding, the stakes are high, but the crushing loneliness is gone. This afternoon, I was walking the base grounds with a sharp young captain, a woman who reminds me a little of myself at that age, all fire and disciplined ambition. She was talking through a complex logistical problem, and I was just listening, offering guidance, seeing the path for her. I've become the mentor I always wished I'd had. My relationship with my family found a new, quiet rhythm. We rebuilt, but on a new foundation, with solid, unbreachable boundaries. The desperate phone calls have been replaced by a respectful distance. My father, surprisingly, calls me about once a month. He doesn't talk about his disappointment anymore. He calls to ask for my opinion on world events, on military strategy. It's a complete role reversal, a quiet acknowledgement of a respect he could never voice outright. The most telling sign of the truce came last Thanksgiving. The memory is still warm, a perfect snapshot of the new world I'd built. This time, the dinner was at my house in North Carolina. The air was filled with the scent of my own roasted turkey, and the table was crowded with the people who mattered. Frank and Maria sat at the head of the table, the undisputed guests of honor. My parents and Connor were there too. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells, just a calm, quiet respect. When it came time for a toast, it was my father who slowly got to his feet, his wineglass held in a slightly trembling hand. He looked across the table, directly at me. "To my daughter," he began, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "Major General Sienna Hansen." He took a shaky breath. "She is the one who taught me the most important lesson of my life, that honor and courage are not about the noise you make, but about the quiet sacrifices you endure. I am so proud of you, Sienna." And this time, the words didn't hurt. They didn't feel like a transaction or a performance. They felt, after all these years, like the truth. This morning was the culmination of it all, my promotion ceremony. Before I left the house, I stood in front of the full-length mirror, my dress uniform perfectly pressed. On the table beside me were 2 silver stars, waiting to be pinned on my shoulders. As I looked at my own reflection, my mind went to the Serenity Prayer, the simple words that had become the quiet mantra of my new life. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I thought of the past, the years of feeling invisible, the painful words, the father I wanted but never had. I couldn't change any of it. And I had finally stopped trying. I had accepted it. The courage to change the things I can. I thought of that night in the restaurant, the phone call to General Harper, the difficult conversation on that park bench. I thought of the choice to build a new family with Frank and Maria, to reforge a new relationship with my brother, to define a new future for myself. I had found the courage and the wisdom to know the difference. That, I realized, was the true meaning of peace. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and then refusing to let it define the person I was becoming. It wasn't just a cliche on a coffee mug. It was the map of my entire journey. The ceremony was held in a large auditorium on base, filled with soldiers in uniform, colleagues, and friends. At the front, in the first row, sat my world. My chosen family, Frank and Maria, beaming with pride. And next to them, my biological family, whole and healed in a way I never thought possible. General Harper, now retired but still radiating an aura of command, had agreed to be the one to preside over the ceremony. He gave a short, powerful speech, and then he walked toward me, holding the 2 silver stars. As he pinned the first one onto my right shoulder, he leaned in close. "The whole world sees you now, Ghost," he whispered, his voice for my ears only. He pinned the second star, and I stood taller, the weight of them feeling earned and right. The applause in the auditorium was a deafening roar. But I wasn't looking at the crowd. My eyes were fixed on the front row. I saw the pride in my father's eyes, clear and unambiguous. I saw the happy, quiet tears streaming down my mother's face. I saw Connor's wide, genuine smile, a look of pure joy for his big sister. And I saw Frank, who simply looked at me and gave a slow, proud nod. The soldier's silent salute. That was it. That was everything. In that one perfect moment, the titles didn't matter. I wasn't Ghost, the secret warrior. I wasn't Major General Hansen, the commander. I was just Sienna, seen, loved, and finally, completely free. That journey, from feeling like an invisible ghost to a woman finally seen, was the most important mission of my life. It taught me that our worth is not determined by the family we are born into, but by the boundaries we have the strength to defend and the new family we have the courage to build. My story found its peace, and I truly hope it brings a little to yours. If this story resonated with you, I'd be so grateful if you would hit that like button. And for more stories about turning pain into power, please subscribe to the channel. For the comments today, if you believe everyone deserves to find their own peace, just write one single word: freedom. Thank you for listening,